Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of the Business as Usual podcast. On this Friday night, we're going to talk a little bit about Newcastle United, a little bit about Amazon, and Google as well. Some big news coming out of Google this week. Just remember to follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, follow us on and subscribe on YouTube as well, so you can get these up to date. We're doing them every week, as we mentioned last week. We've done a couple in a row where they've only been about 15 minutes long, so hopefully much easier for people to just listen to quickly at break time or something like that before a lesson, or maybe even potentially during a lesson instead. So 5 stories, we're going to get straight into it. All right, you're going to start with a little story about Amazon.
I'm indeed. So most should be aware that this week, or this past week, Amazon have dipped their toes into the premium sports streaming scene. So they've already dominated selling goods and services online. Now they're going into beef up their Prime Video offer. So they started off with a very lackluster kind of collection of shows and films, etc. But now they purchased for £90 million 2 weeks worth of Premier League football rights, which was a very low cost of investment, and they've seen the biggest uptick in subscriptions since they essentially launched Amazon Prime. So it looks like it has paid off, and for a small fraction of what their competition Sky and BT paid. I mean, if we look at the comparative deals, Sky paid the best part of £3.5 billion for their large share of games, with BT paying £1 billion. So 90 million on Amazon was a very low risk strategy to see what the uptake was, and by all accounts, they gave an excellent service with a little bit of lag. So customers were happy, and they smashed it essentially.
Yeah, I watched a couple of them actually because I have an Amazon Prime account. Especially I watched the Newcastle game last night. Delightful 2-0 win against Sheffield United. Sad when you're celebrating a win against Sheffield United, isn't it? But never mind. This is the state of Newcastle United now. It's interesting for a few reasons. Because first of all, it's a massively different offering to what the existing businesses do. You've got Sky and BT who sort of have the standard kickoff times on a weekend, or on a Friday night or Monday night, maybe as a stretch, but it's on TV. It's through a cable subscription service. Whereas Amazon's is different because it was about streaming. But not only was it about streaming, but it was offering every single game for that match week. So a fan of every single team was able to watch their game, and they kind of staggered the kickoffs a little bit as well. It was very very different, and so as from that perspective, I think it had a bit of appeal anyway. It's really nice to be able to just flick between the different games rather than just have one available at any one time, because obviously BT and Sky don't clash. They tend to have, it's either one or the other. Whereas with Amazon, they had I think they had 5 or 6 games on the Wednesday night and had 2 on last night. So you're able to flick between the two, and it's a different kind of service, isn't it? It's a bit more like what they do in America, where you can get sort of 8 basketball games at a time or 8 baseball games at a time.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's very similar to what we have on Sky, NFL Red Zone kind of idea, wasn't it? Where you can flip between games on American football and you can just see the goals or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, I had to suffer watching us lose to Brighton with a good bit of lag. So it seemed that everyone was very keen to watch us get battered by Brighton.
And that's one thing that they're going to have to look out for, isn't it? Because if they're going to do streaming, in the days now of social media where it's instant news and you've got all the apps on your phone that give you the score updates as soon as they go in, if you want to watch it on Amazon, for example, through a streaming service, you have to accept that you might get things spoiled for you, and that's potentially a big issue that they're going to have to. That might be a bit of investment to try and reduce the lag there, because I know that I turned all notifications on my phone off because I didn't want to have any goal alerts come through and spoil it, or texts come through. So that's something potentially they're going to have to look to improve moving forward. But it's certainly a positive step, and the amount of new signups, I think they said it was a record, didn't they, for one day? That it's something that's potentially an audience grabber. Now, how many of those new signups will be on the 30-day free trial, and then we'll cancel it at the end of the 30
Good
days
question.
is different. But then this is the exact same thing we said about Disney Plus, wasn't it, last week or the week before? They had the exact same thing where they're saying 10 million signups, but how many of those are free trials? And that won't sort of renew. How many of them are just sort of taking advantage of it because the 30-day free trial covers you for both rounds of the Premier League games. So you theoretically could watch them both without actually spending a penny, providing you remember to cancel.
Yeah, I mean, so many people are signed up to the half price Prime deals that they do every now and again anyway. So I mean, at £39, it makes it a great deal, doesn't it? I just wonder if at some point, if we're going to see Amazon Prime Video being like a bolt on, like an extra £5 a month or something, if they start developing it. I can't imagine they're going to be able to afford to provide that at the £79 a year.
Yeah,
No,
or they increase the price
surely
of that.
not.
I think they're more likely to do that than to add a bolt on, though, because anyone who's already had it would feel like they were having to suddenly pay extra for something they've already had. But we'll see.
It's true. It's a tricky one, though, isn't it? Because if you put, say, Prime up to, I don't know, £120, you might start turning off the people that aren't interested in the Prime Video.
£10 a month, isn't it? Yeah.
And is it worth it if you're only buying one or two things a month to get it the next day? Do you know what I mean? It's an interesting dilemma, I suppose.
Interesting thing is that you can have multiple accounts logging on at the same time. Don't ask me how I know that. Anyway,
I was going to say, I didn't know that myself.
No, you can. So, say, for example, if I had a friend who had an Amazon Prime account, I would also be able to log on and watch the football myself using their login. Again, hypothetically, I don't know about that one, of course. It's not something I've done. Anyway,
the bill will be coming from the post.
To the next story. Google have announced some big news this week in that their two founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, have stepped back. So Larry Page has been the CEO, Sergey Brin been co-founder since the company was created over 20 years ago. And by stepping down, it sort of signifies a little bit of an end of an era for the company. They're saying that that's obviously going to be in really steady hands because it's one of their long-standing employees, Sundar Pichai. I knew I'd get that wrong on the podcast. I was practicing it beforehand and everything. He has been the CEO of Google, and he's stepping up to become the CEO of Alphabet. Mike, you're going to say a little bit about how that came about and what Alphabet actually is, because it's not something that a lot of students might be aware of.
Yeah, so essentially Google started off and they made their name on the scene with their search engine, which is obviously they have essentially a monopoly in there. But they wanted to obviously grow the business outside of that search engine. They wanted to use a lot of their profits, their retained profits from that venture, to go into different markets like AI and VR and self-driving cars and buying YouTube and all these acquisitions. They wanted to take lots of risks with some of the retained profit whilst not risking the Google search engine side of it. So they set up separate companies. So they set up Alphabet, which would essentially house all of the risk taking under one roof, and then they had Google, which would still be as it was. So that would essentially be their cash cow, thinking Boston Matrix style. And then what they'd do is they would then transfer profits across from their Google search engine company into Alphabet. But if it went wrong with their, say, self-driving car, which killed someone, for example, then they could only lose what they transfer across if they were to be sued. So it's essentially about limiting, ring fencing risk. So very clever, and it's often done by many businesses these days.
And it's an interesting time for the two founders to step down, isn't it? It's probably the biggest change at the top of a big technology firm since Steve Jobs stepped down. The majority, definitely. I think Jeff Bezos is probably the only one who's still founder and chief executive who still sort of runs this company day to day. But it's an interesting time for Google, as it is for every tech company, because there's all that sort of pressure on them from the data protection and all sorts of all the controversy, antitrust regulation and stuff like that. That is hitting all of these businesses. We've talked a little bit about Facebook having a bit of trouble with that. Google as well. There's a lot of potentially a lot of mess and a lot of things to come up that might cause Google to have to change. And so it'll be really interesting to see how the new CEO, Sundar, takes that on and manages it effectively. It's always a common topic for businesses, and it's a really good one to teach, that sort of the difference between management and changes in leadership and their different styles and their different ways of managing the companies and sort of succession as well. Succession planning is a big part of the year 13 A-level. So loads of topics there that story comes up in, and so something that's well worth looking at for students. Clinton Cards has had some news as well.
It has indeed, yeah. I mean, I think we talked about Clinton cards being in trouble when we looked at the trouble that everyone on the high street was having. So Clinton's cards have been having town hall debates, etc., meetings, essentially to try and work out if they can come to an agreement with the people they owe money to, so their suppliers, etc., and their landlords of their stores. So they were trying to get reduction in rates for them to pay their landlords. So some were for it, some against it. But because they'd gone into administration, they needed a good number of them to agree for the administrators to be happy. So essentially, what they've managed to negotiate is a stay of execution, essentially. So they've got now 1 year where they've been given the rights or the ability to keep trading, but they must start closing down stores or completely renegotiate with every single landlord they owe money to. If they don't do that within the year, essentially they'll get wound up with a CVA, which essentially means that they'll pay so many pennies on the pound to each person they own, and then they will cease to exist.
Yeah, and it's not the first time Clinton's been in trouble. They went through administration in 2012 as well, which is when they were taken over by the current owners, the Vice family. It's not really a huge shock that Clinton's has had trouble. We've talked a lot about sort of the death of the high street and the importance of e-commerce and online businesses. And you look at businesses like Moonpig and funkypigeon.com, and you can't say that without thinking of the tune, can you? Who've made it much easier for, and that sort of social trend towards convenience. And if you can put something online and you can make it so someone can create a personalized card and type something into it and send it without actually leaving their chair or leaving their computer or their phone, that is something that a lot of people want. And so as a result, people aren't thinking, right, after work, I'm going to nip into town and go and get a card from Clinton's or something. The other thing is as well, these things are now increasingly available in supermarkets as well, where sort of again that desire for convenience where everything's available under one roof. And Clinton's, a sort of specialist card company, has really struggled with that. So it's not a huge surprise, is it really?
No, not at all. I mean, I buy all my cards in Tesco, to be fair. And I mean, I used to buy some people cards that now just get a Facebook message. To be fair, thanks to social media.
Tag them in your story on Instagram or something.
Exactly.
Like that. I started doing the funky pigeon thing for my mum, but she told me off. She said she preferred the handwritten note. She said the typed ones didn't have the same meaning, which I understand. So I now have to buy cards again. But you're right. You know, you get them in the supermarket when you're out at the local shop or when you're doing your food shop or something like that. We've got 5 stories as well, so some little things to have a little bit of a research on. We've picked 5 stories. So number 1, Virgin Trains ends on Saturday. It's being taken over by a new company called Avanti.
Story number 2, administrators are in at Jessops as well. All action for the administrators.
Probably a long time coming, that one. As you said earlier when we were talking about that, no one buys cameras anymore. Number 3, John Lewis are offshoring their contact centres.
Story number 4, BooHoo founders are selling their shares, and that is turning off investors. So BooHoo have made great amounts of profits, bursting onto the scene in fashion industry, selling off their shares, taking the money and running, scaring people. Have a read up.
Sharing everyone else who basically owns a part of that company. Story number 5, banks agreed to refinance the Marks and Spencer's debt. So there's 5 stories to have a little bit of a look at and do a little bit more research on. It's really, really important that you are well read, and especially at A level, because the ability to bring in examples of other businesses in any of your essay questions is something that's potentially really, really important and can make a big difference, especially if you're looking for a high grade. So we'd recommend you have a look at those new stories. And next week, we're going to try something a little bit different. We're going to do a bit more of a content-based podcast next week, just to see what the reception is really. So we will have a look at the specifications for GCSE and A-level and try and pick something that we think some students might need some help with, and put together again a 15-minute podcast with some information about that particular bit of the course and some examples of things or examples of businesses that might link to it. So we will see you next week. Thank you very much.
Cheers, guys.